It was Sunday night in Rafah. People would have been normally sleeping in tents too close to each other in an area that was marked by Israel as a safe zone. But suddenly, flames and piercing screams, wailing, and the smell of burning corpses. The people looked in horror as their loved ones burned to death. A series of deadly Israeli bombs were dropped on a camp where hundreds of thousands of people were seeking refuge. It said the aim was to kill 2 senior Hamas members, but the strikes caused a fire and killed at least 45 people and badly wounded dozens of others. In no time, in a place where fabric and wood is being called home, the camp was ablaze and torn and turned to ash. Body parts were scattered everywhere. Children were screaming in fear. Adults were running around looking for their family members. And there wasn't enough water to put the fire out. All they could do is watch. This came days after global leaders urged Israel to adhere to a ruling by the International Court of Justice, ordering it to immediately halt operations in Rafah. The incident has also prompted an international outcry and widespread condemnation of Israel, including Saudi Arabia's foreign ministry, which has denounced in the strongest terms Israel's continuous, quote-unquote, genocidal massacres in targeting tents of what it called our defenseless Palestinian refugees in Rafah. The UN has once again said that Gaza has no safe spaces, and Germany's Foreign Office described the images of charred bodies as, quote, unbearable. French President Emmanuel Macron said he was outraged. Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said it was a, quote, tragic mishap that will be investigated by Israel itself. Israel continued launching strikes in Rafah, and tanks are now stationed in the center of the city. And once again, 1 million people are fleeing the temporary shelters just in the last 3 weeks, according to UNRWA. This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada AlTaher. This week, we're asking what exactly happened on the night of May 26. Why did Israel target a safe zone? And why is Rafah the main focus of Israel's military operations at this point? We spoke with Gazan journalist Rakan Abdulrahman about that night and the situation in Rafah as a whole.
Late on Sunday, Israeli warplanes carried out airstrikes on a center for displaced people in Tel Sultan neighborhood in western Rafah, killing at least 45 displaced Palestinians, among them children and women. Fires was raging through makeshift tents while survivors tried in vain to extract those caught in the flames as it were huge. Bodies of the victims were totally melted and people burned alive. Also, medical crews found dismembered limbs in the scene. As 80% of the Palestinian civil defense capabilities have been destroyed since 7 October, firefighters arrived to the scene after an hour and people had to step in to help to contain the flames. And with severe shortage of equipment, they took 2 hours to finally put out the fire. Health officials in Rafah said they were overwhelmed by the volume and type of injuries, as only one hospital is operational in Rafah due to Israel's destruction of the health system across Gaza. There were cases of amputations for wounded children, women, and elderly people. The ICRC said one of its field hospitals was receiving an influx of casualties seeking care for injuries and burns. Most of the patients who treated had shrapnel wounds, fractures, traumatic injuries, and burns, and they need to travel outside the besieged enclave because of the total collapse of Gaza's hospitals. Since the beginning of the Israeli operation in Rafah 2 weeks ago, Israeli army has designated Mawasi Tel Sultan as a safe area. This area was overcrowded with tens of thousands of displaced Gazans who fled their homes from different cities across the Gaza Strip because of Israeli strikes. When Israel launched its ground offensive on the city, large number of families decided to leave the area, fearing that military attacks could happen. Other families forced to stay because they don't know where to go or they don't have enough money for transportation as it is extremely high. These families were near a UN storage facility, seeking some minimal protection from the continuous Israeli attacks.
In other related developments this week, 3 European countries, Spain, Norway, and Ireland, have formally recognized the state of Palestine on May 28, in a bold move meant to show a way out of the war in the Middle East. This is happening as international and diplomatic sentiment grows to de-escalate the operations in Rafah. But there are doubts that Israel will back off, as it has been quick to reject a ruling from the International Court of Justice last week to stop its offensive in the southern city of Rafah. To know more about this and the reactions on Israel, I'm joined now by the National's correspondent in Jerusalem, Thomas Helm. What do we know so far about how this happened on May 26 from Israel's perspective, and what is their justification for it?
Well, Israel says, and Israel's military says it's investigating. It's definitely true that very quickly after the news broke, there were signs that it was deeply concerned about how this would be perceived. But for now, we haven't seen any concrete explanations from Israel. It says it's investigating. The US says it's happy for Israel to investigate itself for now. But on Tuesday, the IDF did release pictures, satellite imagery, I believe some audio recordings as well, that it believes backs what it thinks is the current explanation, which is that 2 missiles, 2 munitions that Israel fired at Hamas targets in Gaza set off a secondary blaze. No one's exactly sure how. And that, for now, is what they think, what they say they think to believe the primary cause. Obviously, it's massively disputed by various parties, and there's also a great deal of skepticism about Israel's ability to investigate itself. But for now, we don't have any concrete findings from the Israeli investigation.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has called it a tragic mishap or a mistake. How has this been received in Israel?
So I think it all has to be seen in the context of significant public support for the war going on and for an operation in Rafah. So I think for many Israelis, and obviously the government, mistakes and mishaps are acceptable because the wider cause of an operation in Rafah is totally justified. The government is also saying a lot that, it will be an issue that Israel and the military investigates. But I think it's also the case that for a growing portion in Israel, and it's always difficult to judge how large, there is an understanding that the costs of a Rafah operation in terms of the humanitarian toll in Gaza, but also crucially, Israel's image abroad, as we're in the 8th month of the war, and as we see an increasing number of these horrific incidents, people are worried that Israel's image will suffer. And I think one of the main justifications for a Rafah operation that the government offers is that it will be crucial to releasing hostages. Now, I think many people are no longer that convinced of that thesis. And if you can't release hostages, if you can't destroy Hamas in an operation that only a few days into its course is creating such terrible loss of civilian life and torpedoing Israel's reputation, even among its allies, I think many Israelis will ask purely from a strategic point of view, is it worth this?
What has been the reaction to Spain, Norway, and Ireland's decision to recognize Palestine as a state, while the world condemns Israel's actions in Rafah?
It's been met with a massive anger from the government and many Israelis. The response from the foreign ministry was, you could argue, bizarre. It was so angry. It involved mock music videos, long rants on Twitter from the foreign minister. And there was a sense, I think, among the countries that did normalize that we're just going to stay quiet about this because the response is so unhinged. I think I saw something to that effect from the Spanish foreign minister. More concretely, though, the threat of Israel limiting the ability of these countries to operate in the West Bank was also made. And particularly Spain, I believe, was told that it would no longer be able to operate and serve people in that area. Now, it's not actually totally clear what that looks like. And I know from my discussions with diplomats that they are waiting to see. They haven't been communicated clearly, so they will probably start seeing what happens, if they do go into the West Bank. Now, I've spoken to also some civilians from those countries who have actually faced difficulties leaving the West Bank. Now, whether that is directly to do with the normalization, we don't know, but it certainly strikes me as strange. I've never heard of this particular instance of restrictions happening before, and a few days after the normalization, they've happened. So a lot remains to be seen, but it's fair to say that the response to normalization was extremely angry. Now, I think one of the main arguments in Israel is that unilateral recognition is not going to work. It has to be part of a dialogue that involves Israel. Now, that's a position that has been sort of long-standing here for a while, but obviously the reaction to that, the sort of counter-argument, is that, well, Israel hasn't been willing to be in these conversations for a long time, and its current prime minister and many in the establishment say that one of their main purposes in office is to always prevent a Palestinian state. So I think it's an issue that brings up a lot of anger in Israel. People say it's naive, but it's also not surprising when Palestinians welcome it, because they do see it as a moment and a gesture that breaks from an old, dead, largely belief that there's a dialogue to be had between both sides at the moment.
As we know, the ICJ has ruled that Israel should immediately stop its operations in Rafah. But Israel has been unresponsive so far to any sort of pressure, even from the US. What will it take for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to respond to these pressures and end the war in Gaza?
As with all these things, the most obvious leverage that exists over Israel is the US, the relations with the US, and crucially, the material support, the military support that the US provides Israel. Now, there's been lots of talk about what US red lines, what Biden's red lines over the war in Gaza would be. And I think there's now a lot of despair that after the horrible scenes we saw this week, that even that hasn't been enough to enact a significant statement or rebuke from the US. So in terms of what it would take, it's a hard question. I think the big test would be a limit on arms, particularly because Israel relies so heavily, and also it does face other threats from the north, Hezbollah and Lebanon, ultimately Iran, but also countries in which Iran has proxies around Israel, Iraq and Syria. So there is an understanding in military circles of quite how drastic a cut in military aid would be. But again, no one is sure about what the red lines are that would lead to such an American decision. And then, if you want to be extremely pessimistic, you can point to the belief that some have that Netanyahu is involved in this war for his political survival, and therefore there are actually very few things that will stop him.
The International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for Netanyahu, as well as other members from his government and members of Hamas. How has this been taken inside Israel?
Resounding anger. I think most opinion polls show that the majority of the public don't like Netanyahu, don't want him to win an election. But what angered people most was the fact that these arrest warrants came in conjunction with Hamas leaders, and this feeling of equivalence, the feeling that no matter how much we might dislike Netanyahu as a political leader, to compare him to the masterminds of October 7 is an insult to the victims of that day. Now, I think also what it fits into is this wider, and this is in part what's been going on with the ICJ, this wider feeling in Israel that international bodies are biased against it. That can be courts, but also the UN and now many countries internationally. So I think it was largely dismissed. I mean, Israel feels a great deal of pressure when its reputation is tarnished, but I don't think it feels that these courts have that much power over it immediately. But there is definitely concern among Israeli politicians that they now might be the subject of these arrest warrants, and the image damage of looking like pariah leaders is something that really hurts Israel's case as it tries to explain its actions to the world.
That's it from Beyond the Headlines. For more on what's happening in Rafah and Gaza, head to thenationalnews.com. This episode was produced by Arthur Edison and Dua Farid, and I'm your host, Nada AlTaher.